I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna shout, I'm gonna let the reason out that his love goes on forever. I'm gonna take it all the way.
Thanks for tuning in to the Maple Minute this Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021. I'm Pastor Bill, and before we get into today's topic, let me just encourage you, if you're watching us on Facebook, please like us and share our video so that other people can get a chance to see this. And make some comments. We'd like to have some interaction with the people who are watching and hopefully get an idea for what's going on in your life. You know, life's a journey and we all want to share in that. If you're tuning in on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel so you can, and then make sure you click the reminder button so that whenever we post a new video that you'll get a reminder it's out. We're also trying to make those where you can make some comments. So if you'd like to do that, please engage with us. We'd love to hear from you and know what's going on in your life. So let's get into today's topic. You know, the last Maple Minute, we talked about foolishness and folly. That was something that Solomon really couldn't stand. See, Solomon had gotten the gift from God of wisdom. He was the wisest man to have ever lived. But Solomon saw, as a wise man, he saw foolishness in day-to-day life. And he couldn't stomach it. And it was one of those things that just burdened him. Now, I have to warn you, as we go through Solomon's experience in the book of Ecclesiastes, he's looking at life without God. He's looking at life through a secular lens where God's not really the influence that is causing his thoughts. He still is a wise man and still does come up with some thoughts that God would honor, but he's viewing life as a person without God would view life. He's asked, what's the value of life? Life without God, life under the sun. And he is bothered by the foolishness that he sees around him. It bothers me too sometimes. You know, Solomon has warned us in the last Maple Minute we talked about this. Solomon's warned us about foolishness in different areas of life. And the last one we talk about is foolishness in the little things. But today, Solomon wants to talk to us about foolishness in leadership. Leadership is a big issue because you're either a leader or a follower, and sometimes you're both. And who we follow and who leads us is so important. And so Solomon points out some foolish leadership models and what we can surmise from them as he goes through life. In fact, he points out 4 of them, and I just want to cover them real quick. In chapter 10, verses 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 16 through 19 is a weird passage, but that's how it works out. The first group he talks about are those ego-driven leaders. And I'm telling you, those are a problem. He says in verse number 4, if the anger of the ruler rises against you. Now, that's that ruler who's spewing off his hatred, his anger. He doesn't know how to control himself emotionally when things don't go his way. He says if this anger of this ruler, could be a boss, just a leader, rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. And that's great advice here. This is a picture of a leader who shouts and screams at everyone around him because he didn't get his way, because things didn't work out the way he wanted them to go. The leader verbally abuses those who want to serve him, those who are working for him. And let me just stop here for a minute and say this. You should never, and God never wants anybody to have to be abused. God didn't ask you to be a doormat in life. So let me just be clear about this, very clear. You can quote me on this one. You don't have to go through life being abused. In fact, abuse is sin, and we don't want that to be in anybody's life. And if you're the abuser, you don't know how to control yourself. You need to get with God and maybe get some professional help on how to treat people. Now back to what we're talking about. This leader here, this could be a boss, verbally abuses those who serve him or work under him. He thinks he's above everyone else because he's the boss, and the boss is always right no matter what. Which that's an ego-driven boss there. It also means that he thinks it gives him the right to express or oppress those that work for him with sometimes cruel and abusive language. I don't know if you've ever worked with somebody like that. I've worked around people like that, and sad to say, they are difficult to be around. You know, this ego-driven leader, he swells and often bursts out in anger when he doesn't get his way. You know, when we see this boss, this leader, of any kind abuse power, and there again, abuse of power is something that's reprehensible. Our first impulse usually is to walk away. But notice here in this verse, Solomon sort of points out there's a better way to do it. Now, once again, don't submit yourself to abuse. God doesn't give pleasure in that, but make sure we're doing it in the right way. Solomon says here, there's a better way. Don't panic. Don't quit your job just because he said something bad. And don't necessarily have to leave your post. That is something you need to really contemplate. But he also points out what really is the great advice is let's not overreact to an overreaction. Don't overreact to an overreaction. That's really what the ego-driven leader does. He overreacts to things. Just deal with the person is really what Solomon is trying to say there. He says calmness will lay great offenses to rest. He says if you remain calm when things aren't going right, then it'll probably work itself out. Now, there again, sometimes those ego-driven leaders, they don't know that and they just continue and continue, which you shouldn't submit to that. You need to seek good advice and get out of that situation that you're being abused in. But Solomon had pointed this out several times throughout his writings in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1, he says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. In chapter 16, verse 14, he says, a king's wrath, there again, there's your leader, is a messenger of death. And sometimes the boss can do some great harm to you. But a wise man will appease it. And that's what he's telling us how to do it. Appease that. Try and not overreact to it, because the reaction to an overreaction often leads to difficult situations. In chapter 25 and verse number 15, he says, with patience, and those are tough, patience a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. I think about James and what he wrote in chapter 3 of his writings in the New Testament, where he said the tongue is so powerful, it can destroy, it can set worlds aflame, and it is powerful. And he talks about the evil that it can do, but you know, if we learn how to tame that tongue, if we learn how to control it, and the only way we can do that is through help through the Holy Spirit, then we will be masters of our own domain, really. I started to say masters of the universe, and really that may be the secret, because the tongue is so powerful. Rudyard Kipling, he wrote this, which is a pretty famous statement, and I think it really applies here. He said, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, you ever been in those kind of situations? He says, you'll be a man, my son. That's great advice. He says, keep your head. Now, it doesn't mean let someone abuse you and keep going through it. That's not what we're talking about. But he says, if you can keep your head when they're losing theirs, because the ego-driven leader does lose his head. The second group of leaders that are foolish are the easygoing leaders. Easygoing leaders. In verses 5 through 7, Solomon says, there is an evil. and so you right up front, you know this is not a good thing. There's an evil that I've seen under the sun, as it were an error. There's another term that we understand right away. This is foolishness. An error proceeding from the ruler, the leader, the boss. He said folly or foolishness is said in many high places. And that's something that shouldn't happen. This is what bothered Solomon. Foolishness that's exalted. He says folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in the low place. Or the person of a great esteem is set in the low place. And that's a contrast to where it's the opposite of what we would think. He says, I've seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. And once again, what he's contrasting there is this ridiculous situation where foolishness has gotten in control. You see, when you get easygoing leaders, really what they do, or what's happened is an unqualified person has gone and gotten into leadership, and they put more unqualified people, and they ignore those who would be best in the positions to serve. Sometimes they put in family and friends. Sometimes they put in relatives. It's crazy. And often, and here's what you have to realize, in leadership, usually strong leaders gravitate other strong leaders around them and put them, or help them. But here's what you have to know. The opposite's true too. Weak leaders often surround themselves with weak people. I think Solomon would have been good to have taught this to his son Rehoboam, because that's what Rehoboam does. You see, as Rehoboam takes over for his father as the king, Rehoboam, he has some strong leaders around him, the older advisors who were Solomon's advisors, and they give him advice and he doesn't listen to them. He doesn't want to hear it. Instead, he turns to the people he grew up with, his teenage friends, his young adult friends, and they were foolish. They had no experience, and he listens to them, and because of that, he loses the kingdom. You know, easygoing leaders, their problem is they're insecure, and oftentimes they're just lazy. They want everybody else to do everything for them, and yet they haven't put good people in places of leadership around them. But what you have to realize about easygoing leaders is they're very ineffective, and that's terrible to be around. The third type of leader that Solomon presents to us in foolishness in leadership is the engineered leader. This verses 16 and 17, he says, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child." That shouldn't happen. "And your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness." You know, what Solomon's speaking here is about this engineered leader who's inexperienced, who acquires his position, his power, his leadership position, or ruling, or whatever, because he had help from family and friends. Nepotism is what we're talking about here. Engineer. People who are put into power and they really didn't earn the right to be there. You know, I think if you look in culture today, childish leaders are a problem, a terrible problem in today. Not just in politics, but you see them in entertainment and especially in sports, and unfortunately. We've got 20-something year olds out there trying to tell us how we should vote politically, how we should run our government, and they're throwing temper tantrums when they don't get their way, even though they've got millions of dollars and they're getting paid for it. And somehow we feel because they are getting paid millions of dollars to throw a ball through a hoop or throw a football to another player, that we should listen to them in regards to how we should live our lives. Instead of really being good role models, what we find is a lot of these people, they are moral disasters in the entertainment business and often in the sports realm. You know, the engineered leader thinks it's all about him because he's been boosted in his ego too, just because he's been told how great he is by his family and friends. He doesn't really earn the right to be the leader. And because of this, he makes a terrible leader. I've seen this too many times in churches where instead of God being allowed through the church to have a man of God appointed to be the leader, the pastor, what happens is nepotism happens. The pastor decides his son should be the next pastor, and he doesn't ask the church, he doesn't ask God, he just does it because he thinks it's the best thing for his legacy, for his glory. And you can see that ego-driven thing. And usually I think the engineered leader is a product of the ego-driven leader, and he'll turn eventually into that ego-driven leader. That's what I've seen. And that's what Solomon's saying, hey, this is foolishness. This is crazy. This isn't the best. The fourth and final group that he talks about in leadership, the foolishness of leadership, is that group that you probably can guess, the evil leaders. Those just plain bad people. In verses 18 and 19, he says this: "Through sloth," that's laziness, "through sloth, the roof sinks in. Through indolence, the house leaks." And that's just plain ignorance. To sit there, insolence says, hey, I know it's going to happen, but I don't care. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. And you can just get this feeling as he presents this group, that talks about this group of leaders who are foolish, the evil leaders, that Solomon really has no excuses to offer for such a person. This person is just plain evil and cares nothing about responsibility, and that's what you can see here. The lack of, the indolence he's showing, and you can see a lot of this happening in today's leadership in politics, just be honest with you. They don't care anything about their agenda. They don't care about the people. They don't really care. They talk like they do, but they really don't. And through laziness, leadership dissipates. And what happens eventually is a king who leads like this, the kingdom's destroyed. A boss who leads in evil is an evil leader. Eventually, his business or his responsibility areas fall apart. You need to remember, as we finish this up, you need to remember that a good leader walks ahead of his people. That's what Jesus did. In fact, John Maxwell always says the mark of a leader is that he's got someone behind him following. A good leader walks ahead of his people, not behind him, and he points out the way. That's what Jesus did. He said, I am the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. Beside his people, he walks with them to make sure they know what they're doing, and he walks to share on their journey, and he walks behind his people to protect them and cover up their mistakes. That's really the picture of what God did for us. That's what a good leader does. That's what Solomon would want us to know. So what kind of leader are you? Because if you didn't know it or not, you may not think of yourself as a leader, but everyone is at some point a leader and at some point a follower. So look to the people you're following and ask yourself, are they good leaders? And what can I do to help them be a better leader? Because that's our job. And if you don't assume the position of leadership in the right way, then maybe you're following one of these foolish models. Let's make sure that sometimes, I think men especially, we have the ability to become that ego-driven leader in our homes. We need to make sure we don't do that. And let's not just forfeit all of our abilities and become the easygoing leader that doesn't take responsibility serious. And let's hopefully not get put in a position that we don't deserve and become engineered leaders. And let's make sure we don't do that to our kids too. And certainly let's stay away from being evil leaders. Let's lead the people around us. Your friends really, you may not think of this, but you're leading them. So are you leading them in the right place? And most of all, I would say this, let's point out the fact that we have a great leader in Jesus Christ, because he goes before us, he walks with us, and he walks behind us to protect us. So let's remember this and guide people to the greatest leader of all. That would be Jesus Christ.
Cause his love goes on forever. His love reaches to the